Okay, so the election of 2000 was really the most closest historical precedent to that election was the election of 1872, because both of those elections were disputed and it wasn't clear who should be the president at the conclusion of the counting of the ballots. The reason in 2000 is that issue of Florida. In both of those elections, actually, it came down to Florida. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is the importance of the debates. Both of these candidates were kind of running neck and neck. I remember watching the debates and thinking about how different the candidates presented themselves. Al Gore came across as kind of overly mechanical and kind of annoying, kind of know-it-all person, kind of wooden. He was always accused of being kind of inauthentic. Whereas George W. Bush came across as just kind of a guy that was kind of funny, kind of the guy you would want to hang out with if you had to pick between the two. This refers to likability, and what we're starting to see is since the advent of television and the continuation of these debates, this likability factor seems to be pretty important, and that means which candidate do you just like, you'd want to hang out with him. And George W. Bush definitely won that in the debates, even though Al Gore clearly had a command of the very minute detail of policy and a granular understanding of most subjects. What happened once the election took place is that in Florida, they had a confusing ballot called a butterfly ballot, where people had to use a probe and poke through the ballot to indicate their selection. And the way the ballot was laid out was very confusing. And so they had a lot of ballots where it wasn't clear what the intention of the voter was. These little bits of paper that would result when you poke through your ballot was called a chad. Ideally, your vote is so clear that when you poke through it, the entire piece of paper falls out. But in this case, we had little pieces of paper that were hanging on the ballots, and they had poked multiple holes, and it was not clear what the intention of the voters was. So Florida is a very large state, and it has a lot of electoral votes associated with it. And so given the fact that they couldn't decide who won the vote in Florida, that number of electoral votes would determine the winner of the election. So they announced the people who ran the local election board, she was a Republican, and they ordered a recount that favored Bush winning. So the way they were going to go about recounting the ballots was actually in Bush's favor. So Al Gore sues. It's Gore versus Bush, and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that the way the local officials want to structure the recount stands. And so George Bush becomes president, having not won the popular vote and only won the electoral vote through a Supreme Court ruling. So a lot of people thought his presidency would be kind of clouded by this, and maybe his presidency wouldn't be terribly consequential because of that. Anyone who thought that was wrong, because George W. Bush became very comfortable in his role. The shadow of the election did not seem to fall over him, and some very substantial and consequential things will happen on his watch. One thing is that he cut taxes. He is a believer in trickle-down economics, which means cutting taxes. Like Reagan, he was not willing to cut the size of government to the degree necessary to balance the budget, so we had soaring deficits. He also did not foresee that we would be fighting two wars on two fronts during his administration, and he did not budget for those wars in the budget. Those were totally out of budget and not paid for by increased taxation like we had in previous wars. So as a result, our deficits soared. He also added a new benefit to Medicare that included a drug benefit that he didn't pay for through increased taxation either. So the deficits really continued to go, well, not continued, they again returned to kind of off the charts soaring deficits. George W. Bush is also a little bit of a maverick by being a proponent for education reform. His education ideas kind of stole from the Democrats. And his idea was that we should make sure there was no achievement gap between minority students or any other students and the majority of students. And he called this program No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind relied upon a few simple ideas. One is that we should only have high quality teachers in the classroom. And so teachers had to have a degree in their subject. And so a lot of teachers, for example, foreign language teachers that were teaching a language they were not certified or had not gained a degree in, they had to go back and get further education. Also, No Child Left Behind relied heavily on standardized testing. as a means of measuring teacher effectiveness. And so this is when the standardized testing boom kind of hit the public education sector, for good or bad. And that became the measure of whether students were succeeding or not. Also, the No Child Left Behind program said that every subgroup of 40 students you had, if there were 40 students of a certain type in a school, they had to be making a year's worth of progress each year for your school to be a successful school. So if you had 40 Asian students, those 40 students had to demonstrate they'd made a year's progress each year on their standardized test scores. If you had 40 limited English proficiency students, they also had to be making adequate yearly progress. If your school did not take all of your subgroups worth of kids and advance them as they were supposed to, then you could be deemed a failing school. And if you were deemed a failing school 2 years in a row, then your students at your school would be allowed to go to other schools, and the school system would have to pay for their transportation. So it was a pretty radical idea trying to cut the achievement gap and bring every school into compliance. Leesville Road High School was declared a failing school most years. That might surprise you because it seems like people are pretty happy with the school. The reason is that we couldn't get all of our subgroups to show up and take the tests necessarily if they were absent and wouldn't make up the tests. There were a variety of reasons, but whatever the situation, sometimes a school was deemed failing that the community seemed to have a lot of confidence in those schools. So that was an unusual kind of aberration of the program. I've already told you that he came up with a prescription drug program to help seniors afford their pharmaceutical medicines. And that was a very popular program, but not funded in the budget. He also had some other ideas in terms of domestic policy. For example, he wanted to let young people opt out of the Social Security system and invest their deducted money from their paycheck into private stock funds. But that did not pass because a lot of people felt that the stock market wasn't particularly reliable either at ensuring that people would have retirement funds. He also wanted to reform immigration. He was the governor from Texas before he was president. He understood the immigration issues and believed that we should give illegal immigrants an ability to work in the country legally and a pathway to citizenship. But he was not supported by the majority of his party. Most people in his party do not believe that there should be any way for illegal immigrants to become citizens. So neither of those ideas passed. By far, the most important thing that happened on George W. Bush's watch is the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and Flight 92 that happened on September 11th, 2001. We'll be watching a video on this after the exam, but what basically happened is that fundamentalist Muslims who hate us because we support Israel and also do not appreciate us trying to influence the world globally by spreading our culture. Fundamentalist Muslims tend to believe that American culture is too sexual and is immoral, and so they don't appreciate the pervasive nature of our culture growing around the world. And so for these reasons, they formed these radical terrorist cells and plotted to attack the World Trade Center, which is like the ultimate symbol of economic globalization, which is located in New York City. They plotted to attack it by flying planes into both of those towers that stood. And never before had planes been used as weapons. Usually we had hijackings of planes where people, the hijackers had wanted to negotiate, and we landed the planes on the ground, and eventually they freed the passengers and got their demands met. But in this case, it was the first time ever that we realized that they actually were going to use the planes as a weapon, and that the terrorists on board were, in fact, on a suicide mission. As a result of this, we engaged in a war in Afghanistan. The Taliban was the government of Afghanistan. It was a religious government. They had allowed Al-Qaeda, the terrorist cell, to train in their country, and that was led by Osama bin Laden. And so we decided that since that government had given them security and safety to train to attack the United States, that it would be appropriate for us to overthrow the government of Afghanistan, which we did with NATO support. If you remember, if we are attacked, our allies have to come support us. So with NATO support, all of our allies came and helped us overthrow the Taliban, establish a new government in Afghanistan. Lately, the first president elected was Hamid Karzai. And Afghanistan is a unstable democracy right now, and it is beset by corruption and lots of problems. and it has not been an easy war to extricate ourselves from. We are still in the process of that in the Obama administration. Iraq is a different situation. Iraq, we attacked them first. President Bush had an opinion that since Iraq seemed to be developing weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, seemed to want to attack the United States with those weapons, that we should attack them first. And this is called the Bush Doctrine, that if you think there's an imminent attack on the nation, then you can attack that nation before they attack you. And so we attacked Iraq first. We overthrew Saddam Hussein, their leader. And we found that, in fact, he had been bluffing the entire time, and we found no significant weapons of mass destruction that we did not know of before in any stashes. Saddam Hussein was captured and tried in the Iraqi courts and eventually put to death. That video is actually viewable on YouTube. In the meantime, inter-ethnic rivalries broke out between Sunnis and Shiites on the ground in Iraq and complicated the rebuilding of Iraq to a great degree. President Obama promised to get us out of Iraq, but eventually had to do, even before Bush left office, he had to do a surge where he actually sent a second wave of Americans to fight the counterinsurgency in Iraq. Now Iraq is a rocky democracy as well, and we have withdrawn from Iraq under the Obama administration, but for 10 long years we tried to bring peace and a stable democracy to Iraq. President Bush's second term was very troubled. The wars that we thought we could win so easily, as Operation Desert Storm had gone under his dad, they did not go as easily as we thought, and America wasn't nearly as militarily powerful as we believed. And so the wars bogged down both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we realized how expensive it is to try and fight in Iraq all by ourselves. Also, we had this horrible hurricane in New Orleans called Hurricane Katrina, and Bush was seen as being late in responding. There's a famous picture of him flying over New Orleans from an airplane, from a helicopter, just looking down, but not actually putting his feet on the ground. A lot of people accused, I think Kanye West among them, accused the president of being racist, and if New Orleans had been predominated by white people, that the response would have been very different. But the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, FEMA, just seemed unprepared to respond to a crisis of this type. The biggest thing is that at the end of the Bush administration, a huge economic problem came to light. What had been happening all throughout the 2000s is that mortgage companies had started selling houses to people who could not afford them. The mortgage companies usually don't do this because they know that 30 years later, or whenever they do give a house or sell a house to someone who can't afford it, that person will have to pay the mortgage company back, and they won't be able to pay them, and the mortgage company will lose money. But what they started doing is selling the mortgages. The original bank that sold the person the house would take the mortgage and sell it to another company to hold. And so mortgage companies became very unconcerned with whether in fact someone could pay back the loan that they were giving them. So they were selling a whole lot of houses, and so the prices of houses went up because demand was going up and supply was staying the same. But eventually what happens is all these people who own houses that they can't afford can't make the payments. And the people left holding the mortgages that had originally been sold by some other company, they realize that they are holding a bad investment. This leads to a domino effect, and the whole mortgage crisis real estate market collapses. That leads banks and insurance companies to also start to collapse, and that's when President Bush realizes that he has these businesses that are too big to fail, that in fact, if we allow them to fail, that the entire economy could unwind and we could have an unprecedented depression of ultimate proportions. As a result, despite the fact that he's a Republican, he has to start bailing out major businesses, banks, and insurance companies like Goldman Sachs, for example. And he passes a law called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, with the assistance of the Democratic Congress. They pass this and bail out all of these businesses, basically saving millionaires from losing their money, but the people who had lost their houses remained without houses just the same. As a result, this leads to the most massive economic crisis we have had since the Great Depression, and that is how he leaves office. A very troubled ending to a consequential presidency. See you in class.